We like stories. It could be books, movies, television shows. We like stories. But let me ask you, do you prefer a happy or bizarre ending? You know, sometimes we watch a movie or we even read a book and it ends and we say, well, why did it end that way? Now, we like good stories. And Jesus' parables are definitely good stories. I think we especially like the ones with the happy endings. We like the prodigal son. Yes, the older brother kind of puts a damper on the end, but the younger son coming back, that's just a happy ending. We like the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin. They have happy endings. The parable of the householder is a different matter. It has an unusual ending, and some think it doesn't really end right. It is not the favorite of the parables. Neil Lightfoot said in this parable, we're confronted here with the most puzzling of all the parables. This parable is in Matthew chapter 20. It is preceded by Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler. He wanted to know what he needed to do to obtain eternal life. Jesus says, obey the commandments. He says, I've done that. Then Jesus says, sell all that you have, give to the poor, and follow me. He was unwilling to do that. Well, after that, Peter asked a question in chapter 19, verse 27. We have left everything to follow you. What then will there be for us? Here's the rich young ruler. He's a good man, but he's unwilling to sell what he has to give to the poor. The reaction, I think, from the disciples is, well, you know, if a rich man can't be saved, who can be? Peter says, we've given up everything. What is there for us? What is our reward? Well, Jesus answered, you're going to have a great reward both now and later. He says, I tell you the truth, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. Jesus says, well, Peter, the reward is great. You are going to be blessed now. You're certainly going to be blessed later. When we come to chapter 19, verse 30, we have a statement, but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. It's unfortunate that we have the chapter break there. Jack Lewis points that out, because really that goes with what follows. Our text is Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. This is the parable with the strange ending. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. About the third hour he went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. He told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. So they went. He went out again about the 6th hour and the 9th hour and did the same thing. About the 11th hour he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing? Because no one has hired us, they answered. He said to them, you also go and work in my vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. The workers who were hired about the 11th hour came, and each received a denarius. So when those who were hired first came, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These men who were hired and worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. But he answered one of them, friend, I am not being unfair to you. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. We notice that this parable is bracketed by the statements before and after, but many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Let's consider the background of this parable as it is told. This could be a very typical situation in Palestine. It was time for the grape harvest. Vineyards were all over Palestine. And it was harvest time about the end of September, and that was just before the rains came. In that part of the world, the rains tend to come almost all at once. And so when it's time to harvest grapes, you better get them in before the rains start. The harvest is a frantic race against time. Well, the workday was from sunup to sunset. Now that could vary with the time of year, but basically the day would be divided into the 12 parts. And so we read that the landowner went out early, 6 o'clock, then at 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 5 o'clock. When you had the grape harvest, when you were in this rush of time, you wanted to use all available workers, whether for a long or short period. And they were paid. The first ones who were called were offered a denarius. A denarius was basically just enough money to get by for a day. You could feed your family for that day. It was to be paid at the end of the day. The law of Moses, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 13 says, "The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning." The boss is not to keep back the money, even for that one night, because it could mean hunger for the worker and his family. These men were at the bottom of the socioeconomic status. They did not have property more, excuse me, did not have property more than likely. They were just day laborers. Jesus begins the parable by saying the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers. The kingdom, the rule of God in the lives of people, is like what Jesus is now going to describe. How is the kingdom like? The landowner hiring the workers. Well, we will see that. He hires the workers, these day laborers. He hires a group at first, agrees with what he's going to pay them. He hires others during the day. The first one, he says, well, I'll pay you accordingly, pay you rightly. He goes out 1 hour before quitting time. You find some men who are just standing there. Now, they're not standing there because they don't want to work. They're in the marketplace where people go to get the day laborers, and nobody's hired them yet. Somehow or the other, they missed out on that. But he says, well, you go work too. Where the part comes that seems a bit strange to us is when it's time to pay the workers. He calls those who had only worked 1 hour, those last hired, he calls them first, and he gives them a denarius. That is a day's wage. He gives them a full day's wage for working 1 hour. Well, he pays the others, and when he gets to those who were hired first, they decided, well, he gave them a denarius for working on 1 hour. He will give us more money. But he only gives them a denarius. And so they grumble. Well, the owner of the vineyard makes a threefold defense of his actions. He says, I haven't done any injustice to you because you agreed to work for a denarius. Second, I have the right to use my own possessions. I can exhibit a gracious spirit to those if I want to. And third, your complaint is an indication of a spirit of jealousy. You begrudge goodness and mercy extended toward others. Basically, the case of those who were hired first is Not that they've been treated unfairly, but out of jealousy they find fault that others have received too much. If those who had only worked the 1 hour had received just a portion of a denarius, they would have been okay with that. But they were unhappy that these who worked only the 1 hour had received the same thing as they who had worked all day. Well, as workers, we can understand that. That's what makes this story a bit strange. Thomas à Kempis said, "How rarely we weigh our neighbor in the same balance in which we weigh ourselves." Those first workers were looking at their own situation. We worked all day. These folks only worked an hour. Why are you treating them the same as us? Well, what does this mean? Just what does this mean? Prentice Metter said, "We are loved by God because of who He is, not because of who we are. God is like a landowner who pays his employees not according to their merits, but according to his nature." Peter had said, "Okay, we've given up everything to be with you, Jesus. What are we going to receive?" Jesus says, "You're going to receive a great reward." But then he tells this parable to point out it's not really about what you do. It is about what God does. It is about who God is. Those who were called to work in the vineyard are extended grace, first simply by being offered an opportunity to work. But then they are offered grace by the landowner because he gives them what he wants to give them. And he gives a denarius even to the one who only worked the 1 hour. David Hill says the main point of the parable is not concerned with vocation, or with the equality of all men before God, or with the equal value in God's sight of all work done for the kingdom. Its main concern is to declare the sovereign grace and goodwill of God, which welcomes in Jesus the latecomers into the kingdom. The essential point of the parable is like that, like the householder. His generosity transcends human ideas of fairness. No one receives less than they deserve, but some receive far more. Peter, his fellow apostles, have given up much. They're going to be rewarded for that, but it's not really a reward for what they have done. It is reward because of the grace of God. And so it is with each and every person. We do not merit one part of our salvation. We do not earn heaven. We do not earn forgiveness. It is the gift of God to us. And so as we think about our spiritual situation, as we think about what God has done for us through Jesus Christ, through his grace, let us be thankful. There might be those who have served Christ for many, many years. Wouldn't it be an unkind thing if a person came to Christ late in their life, they had not had the opportunity before, had not heard the gospel before? Would it be an unkind thing, or wouldn't it be an unkind thing to say, why should this person receive forgiveness and eternal life here at the end of their life when I have served the Lord all my life? No, I don't think we want to do that. Someone put it in a little poem. I dreamt of heaven the other night, and the pearly gate swung wide. An angel with a halo bright ushered me inside. And there, to my astonishment, stood folks I'd judged and labeled as quite unfit, of little worth, and spiritually unable. Indignant words rose to my lips, but never were set free. For every face showed stunned surprise. No one expected me. We may think, this is parallel to those first workers hired, we may think, well, you know, I deserve to be saved. But no, we don't. None of us deserve salvation, but it has been given to us by God. Now, we might want to point out that this parable contains no encouragement to delay accepting the Lord. Each worker came at the first invitation. The hour of service is now. Tommy South said about this parable, when we understand what this parable is all about, it does end right. This parable is about the grace of God, although the word grace is not anywhere in it. That is precisely why the ending does not match our ideas of fairness. Grace and fairness have little in common. Grace is getting more than we deserve, not what we deserve. Which of us would be so bold as to ask God to give us what we deserve? No, we want Him to give us what we need, His mercy and forgiveness. Sellers Crane Jr. offered this summary of the parable. In the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, Jesus was using an illustration from everyday life in ancient Israel to teach that whatever reward we receive is given by God's grace. It is about God's prerogative to reward people as He sees fit. The landowner represents God. He was perfectly fair in His dealings with all 5 groups of workers, since He did exactly what He said He would do for each group. Likewise, God will do exactly what He has promised to us. We remember John Newton. He said, when I get to heaven, I shall see 3 wonders. The first will be to see many persons there whom I did not expect to see. The second will be to miss many whom I did expect to see. The greatest wonder of all will be to find myself there. Who will be saved by the grace of God? Every person that is saved. The parable doesn't have such a strange ending after all.